Sometimes, as he lay there, he seemed to see, in a waking dream, a different fire. And he saw next to him, not the Indian cook, but another man, a man with shorter legs and longer arms. This man had long hair and deep eyes, and made strange noises in his throat. He was very frightened of the dark, and looked around him all the time, holding a heavy stone in his hand. He wore the skin of an animal on his back, and Buck could see thick hair all over his body. Buck sat by the fire with this hairy man, and in the circling darkness beyond the fire, he could see many eyes, the eyes of hungry animals waiting to attack. And he growled softly in his dream until the Indian cook shouted, "Hey, Buck, wake up!" Then the strange world disappeared, and Buck's eyes saw the real fire again. When they reached Dawson, the dogs were tired and needed a week's rest. But in 2 days they were moving south again, with another heavy load of letters. Both dogs and men were unhappy. It snowed every day as well, and on soft new snow it was harder work pulling the sledges. The men took good care of their dogs. In the evenings, the dogs ate first, the men second, and they always checked the dogs' feet before they slept. But every day the dogs became weaker. Buck had pulled sledges for 3,000 kilometers that winter, and he was as tired as the others. But Dave was not only tired, he was ill. Every evening he lay down the minute after the sledge stopped, and did not stand up until morning. The men looked at him, but they could find no broken bones. Something was wrong inside. One day, he started to fall down while in his harness. The sledge stopped, and the driver took him out of his harness. He wanted to give him a rest and let him run free behind the sledge. But Dave did not want to stop working. He hated to see another dog doing his work. So he ran along beside the sledge, trying to push Solex out of his place. When the sledge made its next stop, Dave bit through Solex's harness and pushed him away. Then he stood there, in his old place in front of the sledge, waiting for his harness and the order to start pulling. The driver decided it was kinder to let him work. Dave pulled all day, but the next morning he was too weak to move. The driver harnessed up without Dave and drove a few hundred meters. Then he stopped, took his gun, and walked back. The dogs heard a shot, and then the man came quickly back. The sledge started to move again. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had happened. Chapter 5. More Hard Work. 30 days after leaving Dawson City, the team arrived back in Skagway. They were very, very tired. Buck now weighed only 50 kilograms, and the other dogs were also very thin. They were not ill. They just needed a long, long rest. But at Skagway, there were mountains of letters waiting to go north. So the men had to buy new, strong dogs. The old ones, now useless for work, were sold. 2 American men, called Hal and Charles, bought Buck and his team, together with the harness. Charles was 40 years old, with light hair and watery blue eyes. Hal was a young man of 20, with a big, shiny gun and a big knife in his belt. These things, more than anything, showed how young he was. Both men were clearly new to the North, and its hard and dangerous life. They took the dogs back to their untidy camp, where a woman was waiting. This was Mercedes, Charles's wife and Hal's sister. Buck watched the men take down the tent and load all their luggage on the sledge. They didn't know how to do it sensibly, and every time they put something on the sledge, Mercedes moved it. Often they had to take things off the sledge and start again. 3 men came up and watched, laughing. "You've got a heavy load on that sledge," said one of them. "Why don't you leave the tent here in Skagway?" "How could we live without a tent?" asked Mercedes, throwing up her hands in the air. "It's spring now. You won't have any more cold weather." "I must have a tent," she answered, and helped Charles and Hal with the last few boxes. "Do you think that load will stay on?" asked another man. "Why shouldn't it?" asked Charles. "Well, it's a bit heavy on top. Do you think your dogs will be able to pull that?" "Of course they will," said Hal. The sledge was now ready to go. "Come on, dogs, pull!" he shouted. The dogs pulled as hard as they could, but the sledge did not move. "The lazy animals!" shouted Hal, picking up his whip. But Mercedes stopped him. "Oh, Hal, you mustn't!" she cried, pulling the whip away from him. "The poor dogs! You must promise to be nice to them, or I'm staying here." "You know nothing about dogs," answered Hal. "Leave me alone. Dogs are lazy, and you have to whip them. Everybody knows that. Ask those men if you don't believe me." Mercedes turned and looked at the watching men. "They're tired, if you really want to know," said one of them. "They've been working very hard, and they need a rest." "Rest?" laughed Hal. "These stupid dogs are just lazy." Now Mercedes decided that her brother was right. "Don't listen to that man," she said. "You're driving our dogs, and you do what you think is best." Now Hal used his whip on the dogs. They pulled and pulled, but the sledge stayed where it was. Hal was still using his whip when Mercedes stopped him again and put her arms around Buck. "Oh, you poor, poor dears," she said. "Why don't you pull hard? Then nobody will whip you." One of the men watching now spoke again. "I don't care what happens to you," he said, "but I'm sorry for the dogs. The sledge is frozen to the snow, and you'll have to break it out. Push it from one side to the other to break the ice." Hal tried again, but this time he broke the ice under the sledge. The heavy sledge started to move slowly, Buck and his team pulling hard under the whip. After 100 meters, they had to turn into another street. It was a difficult turn, with a top-heavy load, and Hal was not a good driver. As they turned, the sledge went over onto its side, throwing boxes and packets into the street. The dogs didn't stop. The sledge was not so heavy now, and they pulled it easily on its side. The whip had made them angry, and they started to run. Hal cried, "Stop!" But the dogs continued through Skagway, and the rest of the luggage fell off as they ran. People helped to catch the dogs and to pick up all the things from the street. They also told the men that if they wanted to reach Dawson, they needed twice as many dogs and half as much luggage. Hal and Charles went back to the camp and started to look at the luggage and throw things away. Tent, blankets, and plates were taken out. Mercedes cried when most of her clothes went. When they had finished, Mercedes was still crying. There was a lot of luggage on the road, and there was still a lot to go on the sledge. Then Charles and Hal went out and bought 6 more dogs, so they now had 14. But the new dogs were not real sledge dogs, and they knew nothing about the work. Charles and Hal put them into harness, but Buck could not teach them how to pull a sledge. So now there were 6 dogs who couldn't pull at all, and 8 who were tired after pulling for 4,000 kilometers. But Charles and Hal were happy. They had more dogs than any sledge that they had seen at Skagway. They didn't know that